Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Join us on this week's PreserveCast episode as we talk with Mary Cleary, Senior Editor at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Michael Knapp, Chief of Historical Services at the American Battle Monuments Commission, about their newly released book, Time Will Not Dim, American Battle Monuments Commission, A Century of Service, 1923 to 2023. Mary and Michael will take us through the book, their experience working on it, and the history and future of the ABMC. All that and more on this week's PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. And today we're thrilled to be joined by two guests to PreserveCast. We're talking with Mary Cleary, who's the Senior Editor at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as well as Michael Knapp, who is the Chief of Historical Services at the American Battle Monuments Commission. And we're going to be talking about what those two entities do and how they have collaborated together around a newly released book called Time Will Not Dim, American Battle Monuments Commission, A Century of Service, 1923 to 2023. And so we're going to be talking all about that. But like we normally do, we like to get to know folks before we start chatting. So maybe I'll toss this out to Mary and then we'll go to Michael. Mary, where'd you grow up and how does one get into the kind of position that you're in today? What was your path to working at the Smithsonian?
So I grew up in the Hudson Valley in New York, and I came south to go to college. And after I graduated from Mary Washington, I decided to stay on in Washington and try and make a go of it there. I had majored in English, and I decided that I would try for publishing. So one of my first jobs was actually working as an editorial assistant for Harcourt Brace Jovanovich Publishers in college textbooks. I helped work on their humanities lists, and while at HBJ, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with former Senator Eugene McCarthy, who at that time was on the board of directors, I believe, and he had an office in the Washington office of Harcourt where I worked. From there, I transitioned to the Smithsonian in 1990. It was really the most extraordinary bit of luck. I had seen that the Sackler Gallery was looking for an editorial assistant, and it was literally a cold call to the front desk. And I said I was interested in this, and I was brought on board within a few weeks. And that was the beginning of my Smithsonian career. My background is really in English literature, publishing, and international studies, but all of that has I've been able to apply beautifully to my job here at the Smithsonian.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a perfect fit for this project that we're going to be talking about today, sort of the blending of all the different pieces, because there's a lot of everything that you're talking about in this book, and not only in the book, but in the American Battle Monuments Commission. So, Michael, before we define what ABMC is, we'll pitch that to you after this. What is your story? Where'd you grow up, and how did you get into this line of work?
So I was actually born in Washington, D.C., and very quickly I was taken home to Northern Virginia, and I grew up predominantly in Falls Church, Virginia. And I ended up, I went to college at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And from there, I worked mostly in the Northern Virginia area for many years. I worked for the National Archives for about 13 and a half years, and then relocated to Vermont with my wife. And we lived in rural Vermont. I worked at Middlebury College for several years, all in history. In the course of that time, I I had a bachelor's in history from VMI, and then a master's from George Mason, and subsequently did some museum history courses at George Washington University. And from Vermont, while we were living there, I was in the National Guard, and I deployed to Afghanistan, came back from that deployment, and was offered a job working for the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so subsequently moved down there, and from there moved back to the DC area and worked as the assistant director of Army Museums for the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And I worked there until 2014, when I went back to Afghanistan as the chief of historical, as the command historian for U.S. Forces Afghanistan. And when I returned from that right about the end of 2014, I was offered the opportunity to move from Center of Military History over to the American Battle Monuments Commission as the chief of their historical services, which I did in 2015, and I've been there since then.
Well, and for people, this is an audio podcast, but you can't see Michael. He has what appears to be sort of his own personal military museum behind him, which I'm enjoying taking a look at. It's actually sort of a perfect segue, though, from, you were talking about here's all the things that you did, and then you ended up at the American Battle Monuments Commission. And for a lot of Americans, it's not something that they bump into too often unless they go overseas. And I think that's one of the great things about this book, is that it introduces or reintroduces or reframes this amazing organization and agency for an American audience. But maybe, Michael, you could kind of tell us about what the American Battle Monuments Commission is for somebody who has no awareness of it.
Yeah, and for anybody that's listening on this, if you don't have any awareness of ABMC, don't feel bad, because you are certainly by far in the majority. The ABMC was created in 1923 as a result of the First World War, and I'll try to Reader's Digest this real quickly, but with about between 80 and 100,000 casualties of Americans from our 18 months in that war, America was faced for the first time with the decision of what do we do with all those bodies, and how do we commemorate the service? And there are two sort of parallel missions that converged. At the end of the day, the Army Graves Registration Service created permanent cemeteries, 8 permanent cemeteries in Europe, where World War I soldiers were interred. And they basically gave families a choice of whether they wanted to have the bodies returned home or buried overseas. About 60% chose to have the bodies returned, and that was all paid for by the U.S. government. The remaining 39+% opted for burial in permanent cemeteries overseas. The land was given to the U.S. in perpetuity by the host governments, in this case for World War I, primarily France, as long as they were used for cemeteries. And at the same time, General Pershing, who had commanded the American Expeditionary Forces, was concerned about the proliferation of monuments across Europe. Sometimes down to the company level, people were putting up these monuments, and some of them were just built out of rubble, and some were intended to be fancier. And they didn't want it to turn into Gettysburg. So basically, Congress created the American Battle Monuments Board, and in 1923 it was turned into the American Battle Monuments Commission, with General Pershing as the first chairman, and they were responsible for determining and approving any memorials that would be erected to commemorate the service of American forces in the war. And shortly thereafter, the cemeteries were added into the ABMC portfolio, and that's primarily what we're known for. So the ABMC is a small agency of the executive branch of the federal government. I think we have a total of about 480 employees worldwide. Predominantly, those are foreign nationals that work at the different cemeteries. And we administer 26 cemeteries and 32 monuments in 17 foreign countries. There is, at every cemetery, there is an American superintendent. At some of the larger ones, there's an American assistant superintendent. And then the rest of the staff at those cemeteries are all locally hired nationals. Following World War II, they copied the World War I model and created additional cemeteries. The most famous of those that people, let me say the most well-known certainly, is Normandy, the Normandy American Cemetery. After World War II, the U.S. government went to a program of what we still use today, which is called concurrent return. When individuals are killed, their remains are returned to the United States for burial either in private cemeteries or national cemeteries. So we don't have any new cemeteries, but we do have movements to put up monuments to continue our mission. That's still part of our mission. And the ABMC is governed, if you will, by a presidentially appointed secretary and a board of commissioners. We currently have 11 commissioners. In its early days, I think there were only 7, but we're up to 11 now. And those are appointed by the president, and they serve at the pleasure of the president. And then we have the smaller staff of federal workers. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of who we are and what we do. But for anybody that's watched any of the Normandy anniversaries, that's what our cemeteries are like. And we kind of think we're the gold standard there.
I would agree with that. I think it's a perfect way to put a capstone on that great explanation. It's like you've been asked this question before. The gold sort of example of cemetery maintenance and care. I mean, seeing the overseas cemeteries is a different experience. And if you don't well up with a little bit of emotion going and seeing those places, well, anyway, it's a powerful experience to see them. And so I would certainly encourage people to not only do it, but if you can't do it, at least take a look online and see these places, or pick up a book like the one we're talking about today, which is Time Will Not Dim, the American Battle Monuments Commission, A Century of Service. So we heard from Michael that this started in earnest in 1923 after World War I, trying to figure out what to do with this incredible amount of casualties caused by America's pretty brief engagement in that conflict, and then the subsequent experience of World War II. I'm curious. Maybe we'll kind of move over to Mary here and talk about how did this come about. I mean, obviously it's a big anniversary and a commemoration, but where did the collaboration come from, and how does this book kind of take on a century of stories in a way that is digestible?
So ABMC wanted to create a centennial publication that would be published around June of 2023 of this year, honoring their 100 years of service. And they knew that they wanted a coffee table book, but they really wanted a beautiful book. And so ABMC very thoughtfully turned to the American Art Museum here at the Smithsonian. My colleagues and I here in publications, we do art books every day. We publish them every year. So we're very familiar with the kind of high production quality values that go into making a book that is not only informative, but also just beautiful to look at. So I think ABMC approached our director's office and said, maybe this would work as an interagency project. And so once those conversations got underway, we were really kind of off and running and started meeting in December of 2021 to really start unpacking this idea of a centennial book. My team here at SAM had to get familiar pretty quickly with not only ABMC's commission history, but also with the world history that their work comprehensively deals with every day. World War I, World War II, and then the other conflicts and memorials that their work honors. So really, it was our teams meeting in the middle. We met once a week for 18 months, working on this idea. And the first order of business, really, before we could even get to writing and editing and proofreading, was to really develop the idea of what story ABMC wanted to tell. So we tossed around a few ideas, but we realized that because the book would be celebrating a centennial of ABMC's work, that really it was meant to honor ABMC, but also in the process honor the service members whose sacrifice is at the center of their work. So it was really kind of two ideas that we had to sort of weave together and bring into the middle. Now, in a coffee table book, you have it's a majority of visual, right? It's a lot of images with minimal text. So we had to really start sifting through not only the visual assets that ABMC has, the photography it has of its sites, but my team here also needed to do a bit of photographic research to try and, I guess you could say, fill in the blanks or look for visuals that would help support the narrative of the story. And we realized that the story that we really wanted to tell would entail looking at how ABMC thoughtfully and deliberately designed these sites from day one, from 1923 right to the present day.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that, in that people listening might be like, well, what is the art piece of this? But if you go to one of these cemeteries, particularly the ones with the World War II dead, the soaring sort of early mid-century modernist design, the maps, I'm thinking of like the bas relief and these sort of iconic big structures, these powerful big concrete, in some cases sort of almost early brutalist, sort of on the edge of that kind of art and design, is really something else. I mean, they are a product of their time, and so I think that's an interesting piece here for people who say, perhaps they're not interested in World War II cemeteries, but they're interested in modernist design. There's a little bit of something in here for everyone, and there are some powerful places that we don't really have like it stateside. You don't really see that with, I've always been curious about that. I mean, that's a whole other probably podcast, but why the American cemeteries here didn't really reflect that. I mean, they're so soaring and so powerful overseas. It's a very different experience here stateside, but that's another conversation. But I just wanted to point that out, that there's a really big artistic piece to this story as well, really profound.
Yes, and it involves comprehensively so many elements across the sites themselves. I mean, you have literally the design of the headstones, the marble headstones, which are very simple white crosses and stars of David. But the deliberate design, goes well beyond that, to give Americans who fell in Europe these absolutely, beautiful contemplative places to rest. There's also memorial chapels. There are individual pieces of sculpture and artworks within the cemeteries. There are, of course, the battle maps, which are beautiful mosaics. I was
just going to say, the maps are like something else. I mean, you could print and frame one of those and put it on your wall. And who knows, Michael might have one in another section of this view.
But the other interesting aspect of the sites themselves is ABMC also considers local horticulture to enliven and make these places supremely beautiful. So ABMC considers absolutely every detail within a cemetery site It's not just one thing. It's comprehensively all of these elements. And they want to use, art and symbolism to underscore American achievement and American sacrifice, and to give people who do visit the sites these very contemplative places where they can consider, what happened there. The cemeteries themselves are often, for World War I and World War II, they're built at or near the battlefield sites themselves. So
Right.
you have not only deliberate design, but you also have this power of place, which I have felt most palpably at Normandy, where I visited several years ago. You just have this remarkable integration of American sacrifice and power of place, because that is actually where it happened.
Yeah, you get that at every one of them. I went to the Musargon and also went to Luxembourg American Cemetery. I mean, they all have a unique feel to them. So we're recording this sort of as we approach the holiday season here, and it perhaps would be a great holiday gift for somebody who's interested in this aspect of American history. Where's the best place to get it, Mary? Where do you recommend people purchase this? So
the book can be purchased at the Smithsonian American Art Museum website. It's americanart.si.edu/books. Just search for the title, Time Will Not Dim, and it will take you directly to the book page where you can order it. You can also write in to the publications office at pubord@si.edu. So that's PUBORD at si.edu. And people can purchase the book.
Yeah, and that's a great way to get it directly and to support the work of the Smithsonian, which touches so many different aspects of American history. I was just meeting with people at the Folklife Center and talking about the work that they do. And then I just saw something recently about the Anacostia Museum. I mean, the Smithsonian touches so many different pieces of American history in so many different ways. And so it's always fun when we get to talk to folks here from the Smithsonian. We've done some previously about foodways. We've talked to people about a lot of different things. I feel like you could talk to someone at the Smithsonian every day and still never cover all the things that you're working on. Michael, I'm curious, this is a retrospective looking back at the last 100 years. And as you mentioned, we don't, as a nation, follow this plan anymore. We don't build overseas cemeteries, and hopefully, God willing, we won't get into conflicts where there are this number of casualties like there were during these massive conflicts of the 20th century. What role does ABMC take in the next 100 years? Is it the same role? Is it become even more of a preservation organization? Because we're losing, I can't imagine you have too many veterans now going overseas to see their comrades. It's not a memorial in the sense that it's providing a place for grief and understanding. It really seems like it becomes more of a preservation organization, but perhaps I'm wrong. Is this a moment to look forward to the next 100 years?
Well, it is. And, honestly, it's a little bit of both. We kind of like to say that, the agency evolved from its origins as a grieving organization that allowed the families and, specifically parents, children, widows, widowers to visit the graves of their loved ones. And as Mary talked about in the book, they were all designed as these deeply sort of moving contemplative places. But we've evolved into a more of an education learning organization in that you rightly point out that, we're getting farther and farther away from these events. So part of our mission is to continually put this information in front of the American public. I mean, that is, we are the federal government, and our job is to make the American public aware of the service and sacrifice of American service members. So having said that, looking to the future, a great deal of what we're doing is an education piece. And I'll put in a shameless plug for ourselves in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We've been collaborating now for about 3 years, I think, on an education program together, using art as the vehicle. And that was, again, the purpose of this book was people may not know about us, but people may love art. They know these famous architects, artists, horticulturalists, and through that medium, we can get people to be more aware of us. Another thing that we work on is trying to provide a historical context. Why are there Americans? And I'll use my favorite little cemetery where I worked for a couple months as an acting superintendent up on the Somme. There's about 1,400 burials there, and it's in the middle of sugar beet fields up near the actions on the Hindenburg Line in November of 1918. Why are there Americans buried here? And so providing that context about the larger history, the military history, the world history, but then giving some rationale to that, the whole idea of the alliances and things like that. So we're doing a lot of history still. I would also say that we will continue in perpetuity. That's a commitment of the federal government to maintain these cemeteries for the next 100 years. I mean, that was the sort of underlying message. We've done this for 100 years. We're going to keep doing it for the next 100 years and on and on and on. But additionally, as other conflicts have happened, we're still working to, as part of the mission at the direction of our commissioners, to memorialize the service and sacrifice of Americans in the other wars. And I would say, just as a background note, there is discussion about memorials to Americans in the Cold War, memorials to Vietnam. Some of these are closer to fruition, others are further away. As you might imagine, our memorials are generally set up in the countries where those happen, so there has to be a bilateral agreement. Korea, I know there is a move, the part of the Korean government wants an additional monument at Incheon to commemorate the landings there. And that's slowly moving forward. But, there's, as you might imagine, there are a lot of issues culturally with countries. Vietnam is not yet ready for us to put a monument there, although we're on better terms. But, these are done in conjunction with us, with our State Department, and then with the foreign governments. So that's part of what we're doing going forward. But it's also preserving the memory. It's preserving these sites. And of course, this beautiful artwork and everything that exists. And as you might imagine, Mary touched on horticulture. That becomes a big challenge with the environment nowadays and what's going on with that. Recently we had a big problem with the water restrictions in France. And all the green grass at our cemeteries, they weren't allowed to water because of the droughts in Europe. So, there's a lot of these things that will go on that will be in preservation in that sense, but it's additional history. And I would also offer that we continue to serve families of those buried and memorialized in our cemeteries. But it tends to be no longer, the spouses. And if you look at the children, most of the children are in their late 70s or early 80s. But it's the grandchildren, the great-grandnephews, the families. And so we're trying to do that through outreach, our visitor services, and to just get the stories out there and to continue to let people know. But one other thing I would touch on is we're also sort of a quiet, passive form of diplomacy by having these sites in these countries. And it's amazing the number of school children that come on tours annually, multiple schools at the cemeteries, because this is a big part of their history. And generally it's a liberation story. So we're probably more well known by children in France and the Netherlands and Belgium than we are by children in the U.S. So part of our mission going forward is to try and expand that knowledge base.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, that's interesting and sort of a good way to kind of begin to cap this conversation about what's next. And so for you, for the next 100 years, we'll have to have you back to talk about that monument at Incheon, because a little personal interest there. My grandfather landed at Incheon, so would love to hear more about that. Mary, what are you working on next? I'm sure you have something in production. Is there anything you can share with us that you're working on?
Well, we are kind of launching a new project on Grandma Moses, the artist Anna Mary Robertson Moses, better known as Grandma Moses. It's an exhibition that's slated to open here at American Art in October of 2025. We're just starting to piece the exhibit catalog together. We're looking at about 4 authors, and the checklist of artworks will be somewhere between maybe 85 and 100. And it looks at Grandma Moses's popularity in mid-century America.
So you're making a hard pivot to something completely different, which is probably pretty interesting.
Well, I've often said this to people, but museum editorial is endlessly fascinating. I mean, every project on my desk is interesting. And I will say that obviously my team greatly enjoyed the ABMC project. As I've told people so many times, I have a personal interest in World War II. So for me, the project, the interagency project to work on Time Will Not Dim was of personal and professional interest to me, for sure. It was just this extraordinary combination of something that I've always been deeply interested in and a chance to work professionally on a project that touches on this very history. So it's been absolutely wonderful.
Well, that probably is a great place to end the conversation. I'm thrilled to have had both of you here to talk about this. It's interesting to hear both about this publication process and then the history of this really fascinating agency and the future of that agency. We'll have to have you back, both of you back at some point to talk about future projects and the work that you're doing. But I want to thank you both for joining us today here on PreserveCast.
Thank you so much, Nicholas.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, we're hoping to work with Mary again. It's still on the drawing board, but we're trying to come up with another project. That was a great experience.
Fantastic. We'll be here for when that happens. Thanks again. Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.